I can go to the Wassenaar Agreement in 1982. And actually there were many reasons why we came to that agreement. And you have to understand, I don't know if this was the case at that time in the early 1980s, that was a major economic crisis here in the Netherlands. I remember because I graduated from the university, and youth unemployment at that time was 25%. So 1 out of every 4 young people below the age of 27 was out of work, which is much higher than it is today. And at that time, I think the moment was right to come to that agreement because it was necessary to redistribute working hours, labors. Until 1980, only men worked in indefinite time jobs. The labor market was very uniform, and most women did not work at that time. And there was high unemployment. And of course, women started to enter the labor market until 1980. Only 1 out of 10 mothers worked outside of the household, which is exceptional in the Netherlands. I remember I was in school in the 1960s, in elementary school, and my mother was the only one who worked who was married and had children. The only other women working were divorced, which is quite unusual at that time too. So whole society was different. And then that large group of young people unemployed who were receiving benefits. Nowadays, young people, if they are unemployed, you're either in school, you're in prison, something's wrong with you if you're young, or you are in some form of employment scheme. But benefits, social benefits for young people, not. But at that time there was. So for the workers, there were a lot of unemployed, which is not good for the membership of the trade union. For the employers, they were having high costs, and it was difficult for them to get jobs properly filled because the wages were low and had to be kept low. For the government, they had to pay an enormous amount on the collective burden, so to speak. The money that was spent on Social Security was exceptionally high. So all 3 of these parties had an intent, had an incentive to go into negotiations in order to deal with that. So it was, of course, the major reason or the major agreement that came out of it was to keep, it was a trade-off between the raise of wages. It was decided that the wages would not be raised in a couple of years, but that there would be a redistribution of working hours. That was the trade-off. So young people had to become employed, women had to become employed, and of course this should not be to the detriment of the traditional worker. So there were lots of incentives, but it was also sort of coincidental, so to speak, that all these economic factors came together, and also that a large group that had never worked outside the house, the women, had to enter the labor market. And because of the price of labor was so low in the Netherlands up to this moment, the price of labor, it has even been pressured more by collective agreements. Then there was room, of course, to make agreements on other points, because the trade unions and the employers did not have to negotiate much on the wages. Well, actually, this was traditional, because before 1982, the wage level was also very constant. Why? Because from the Second World War until 1982, the government controlled the wages. And the government said, well, I will let go of the wages, but then we have to cut that linkage between the social security level and the wages. Only then can I do that. So everybody was involved. Everybody was concerned. There were no groups left out, and of course the Dutch society then was far more uniform than it is now. Why everybody wanted to be involved in that? And why did the labor unions, why did the trade unions refrain from a demand on a wage increase? Because there was a crisis going on. There was high unemployment at that time. So they sort of felt themselves bound by these new agreements that, okay, they would not demand for higher wages if the benefits of that, if the common good, if the money saved by that would go into employment schemes for young people, but also for the older workers themselves that were unemployed. So what was decided was not just that the wages would be kept down, but also that the traditional workers, the men, would work less hours for the same amount of money, but so the wages were not increased. So a limitation of working hours, like say for instance 4 or 6 hours every week, there'll be a reduction from the average working week of 40 hours a week. We went to average of 36 hours a week. So there was a redistribution of working hours, and the wages were held low, and therefore the social benefits could remain to be paid. Once that norm of 40 hours is gone, everybody working, every job interview automatically, there wouldn't be not be any negotiation about the amount of hours worked. But now with all these new people entering the labor market, young people doing menial jobs or in retail businesses, or women, and you have to understand childcare here has always been a private matter. We don't, when children are born, they will go into daycare nowadays, but when I was small, there was nothing for children until they went to kindergarten. So that has always been a private matter. And employers had to adapt. If they wanted to use this female labor force, they had to adapt the hours. So firstly, most women entered the labor market, the part that concerns services, government, education, care and cure, so hospitals and care work, that kind of work. Of course, also often work that has to be done in shifts. So different schemes were just made up, and the employers just adapted themselves to that. And this led to this model that nowadays, typical family in the Netherlands, mother, father, 2 children. The father will work full-time or 30, it's very modern for men to work 32 hours when the children are small, and the woman will work 16 to 20, 24. So between the two of them, they have 1.5 salary, which is sufficient to live on fairly well here in the Netherlands. And then they will have 3 days of childcare. The men in the professional areas, the men will take 1 day off. He'll work 4 days a week. Maybe he'll work 4 days of 9 hours. And then they both have 1 day at home with the children. So that's the typical, that's I think what people strive for. That's the ideal way to do it. Well, of course, not everybody lives in such a family. A lot of women end up by themselves having to take care of children. But if you would ask everybody here on the street, all the students, how do you think you will manage this when you start the labor market? They say, well, I'll work 3 days, my husband will work 4 days, and between the two of us, we will probably share the care of the kids. And Dutch firms simply adapted to that. Part-time working here is not precarious in any way. It's not something that's looked down upon. Actually, for men who work 4 days, it's actually, for a woman, it's very difficult. If I have a meeting, it's very difficult for me to say, well, I have to be at school, I have to pick up my child. But if a man does that, oh, well, it just gives a little, you know, it's acted upon there as a very nice thing to do. So this has shifted. The government had a supportive role, so to speak. For instance, in tax laws, for instance, because normally another decision that was made too was pre-pension. So most people, when I was small, everybody worked until, everybody worked, so all the men, my father, my grandfather, no, not my father, but my grandfathers, they worked until they were 65. One day they worked full-time, next day they were retired. Along with that Wassenaar Agreement, the pre-pensions started to enter. So people would stop at 60 or often maybe even 58 or so. And of course it has to be funded also part by tax law, because normally if you have an income that you have to pay taxes on that. But then the government said, well, you don't have to pay taxes over the first 30,000 euros or so. And then but the government more had a supportive role. And also, whenever something was thought up in the agreement, they would legislate. But the initiative is always at the social partners, always at the trade unions and the employers' organizations. Let's see, drastic increase of the rate of employment was shown through the spread of stable part-time jobs, yes. I think you should emphasize stable, because we also, of course, have precarious part-time jobs. People cleaning offices that have 2 or 3 little jobs, and that with these 2 or 3 little jobs do not earn enough in order to have a proper income. But this is the stable part-time jobs, have the same characteristics as regular jobs. This is true. The rate of employment is increased. I think it's 70% now, actually. Women's labor force has increased enormously. Are there any specific industries? Well, you'll find that in that article that it was mostly retail, care, cure, education, and services at first. But nowadays it's far more common in all kinds of jobs. And even it would be very difficult if you are here at one of these hotshot law offices to become a partner of the law office and work part-time, of course. But anything beneath that, you'll find a lot of people working part-time. Of course, women more than men. And why do the stable part-time jobs have the same characteristics as regular jobs? Because discrimination between full-time or part-time is simply forbidden. And that's European legislation. And of course, the source of that is that part-time labor was women's labor. So if part-time labor was discriminated against, which is very common, the wage level would be 30% below the male wage level, then of course all part-time labor would be discriminative. And so the European Union at one time adopted this directive that says there shall be no discrimination. Of course, discrimination law within the EU is very, very strong, and it has been from the 1950s. And so it's forbidden to discriminate according to the amount of hours per week worked, but also between fixed term and indefinite contracts. Now, fixed term contracts, that's highly problematic to us. Highly problematic. Part-time, not so much. Why? Because the women who entered the labor market were not poor people, were not on the lower end of the labor market. And of course, if you look at this from a cultural perspective, the women who entered the labor market were voters. They're part of the mainstream of society. So of course they could politically and every wise, social cultural wise, you can get the government to legislate the way you want it because you are the largest group of society that votes in the three main parties: the Liberal Party, the Labour Party, and the Christian Democrats. So part-time work was never connected to precarious work, working poor, nothing like that. High employment rate. Well, they say, of course, that economists or sociologists will say this is because of this flexicurity model, where you gain both parties, employees and workers, gain flexibility, and also the workers gain security. Well, actually, at this moment, at the trade union, we say, well, that flexicurity is way up there. That flexibility is way up there, mostly beneficial to the employers, but security just stayed behind. We're not happy with that, and that's mostly because of the use of fixed-term contracts. A line of fixed-term contracts. So at this moment, we have this new social agreement that we concluded, that we're working on right now with the government, and we're trying to contain the use of fixed-term contracts. Whether it works or not, I don't know yet, but that's what we're working on now. But I know that my colleagues in other European countries very often say, well, we don't understand. Why do you give all that away? Why do you negotiate? Why do you keep the wages so low? You could do better. And we say, well, we get enough back, which is uncommon, of course, in other European countries. In France, in Spain, if they have a conflict, immediately they strike, and we don't do that. And whether that's cultural, I don't know. It benefits all of us. And sometimes we're on opposite sides at the negotiating table in the sectors, of course. But there is a strong sense we're into this together, and if we collect all of our power, we'll have a stronger position. So, but I would not say we'll just take it because it has taken a long time to build. To reach that social consensus, what do labor unions, employers, firms have to do? I think they regularly have to reaffirm that they're into this together, that there's a benefit for all three of them. And actually, until 2 years ago, the 10 years before that, or 8 years, ever since, with the very Americanized labor relations and big bonuses for employers, I thought that social contract was cut. I thought we were divided. And I was sort of laughingly, but not totally laughingly, calling it the Ministry of Employers Affairs, not the Ministry of Social Affairs. So we felt we had nothing to gain at the government level. So it's not automatic. We cannot take it for granted. We have to work on it all the time, but we have lots of meetings. I have 3 or 4 meetings a month with government officials, with employer officials. They're all in my iPhone, I can call them all the time. I know them by their first name. That's what's needed here in order to for the upkeep of that system. But it's by no means automatic.
Thank you very much.
Well, invite me one time.
Yeah, sure.